So hopefully you've had a chance to talk to each other and get those wheels turning, thinking about autism and your encounters with it, and what meanings get ascribed to children and young people who have or could have this diagnosis. And I'm here essentially to represent the arguments against the idea that autism as a diagnosis is something that is proving to be either valid or helpful. And I want to base that on two basic ideas. First, for a diagnosis to be potentially useful in a scientific way, you need to have some evidence that this particular diagnosis has the ability to point towards something characteristic that is going on at the biological or psychological level, some ability to carve nature at its joints, some way of representing in an objective way something that is different about children who receive this diagnosis compared to others who don't. And I'm going to give you a little bit of information to let you know about the fact that that is certainly not the case with the diagnosis of autism. We've been researching this diagnosis for decades now. It's become a very popular research topic. There are teams at universities all over, mainly the Western world, who are researching primarily from a biological point of view, and that's where most of the money is going, doing genetic research, doing brain scans, as well as various types of psychological research, and they have failed to come up with anything characteristic. The cupboard, as far as I'm concerned, and I've been looking at this research as it develops over the years, is bare. It's empty. There's nothing in there. Now, the most likely reason that nothing characteristic is coming up seems to be something that is very hard for those who have put their heart and soul in trying to understand the biological or psychological basis of autism, which is that the most likely reason that they're not coming up with anything characteristic is that there is nothing characteristic. The way scientific thinking develops is in what is considered core gold standard science. You start from something called the null hypothesis. The null hypothesis means that you have to assume that whatever your hypothesis is that you're putting forward is not true. And it's up to you then, as a scientist, to prove that the null hypothesis can't be true. But your assumption should always be that whatever hypothesis you've put forward is not true until you've been able to prove that it's impossible for it not to be true. You following me? For some reason, we seem to have carried on with research around autism without coming back to the basic null hypothesis, which maybe what we are calling autism at the moment does not equate to anything that occurs in the natural world. That is the most likely explanation for the fact that we're not finding anything characteristic, because there is no such thing as autism. However, maybe there is no such thing as autism at the biological level, but maybe it is a clinically useful device, a clinically useful tool. So for something to be clinically useful, I put to you, and I will say something a little bit about other ways something can be clinically useful, but I think the basic thing is, and this is from me as a practitioner, and I'm a child and adolescent psychiatrist, so I encounter this sort of situation on a daily basis in my practice. For a diagnosis to be clinically useful, you need to be able to demonstrate that providing the diagnosis in some way leads to treatment decisions that will has evidence behind them that they will make a difference to people with the diagnosis, with your specific treatment, in a way that it wouldn't to people without the diagnosis. That is not the case in autism. We have no autism-specific treatments that have demonstrated that specifically and differentially, those who have the diagnosis will improve in a way that those who don't have the diagnosis won't. And it's led to some very strange things happening in the clinical world. It's the idea of autism clinically has led to, on the one hand, the emergence of what I call two-tier services, particularly in the world of children with various intellectual disabilities. So now in many areas there are specific autism outreach teams. So schools can call on these teams, and that's certainly the case in my county where I work, to come and provide some extra help and advice to the young person, to the teachers, to the school. The sorts of interventions that they provide are actually very useful quite often to people who don't get the diagnosis. So what it becomes is, in order to get a ticket to this quite useful service, you need to get a diagnosis. And if you don't get a diagnosis, but maybe you have similar levels of learning difficulties or other difficulties for which the type of advice and interventions that's available from these teams exclude you from. So you end up with this strange dynamic where strategically, in order to access these services, autism is being used as a diagnosis, as a ticket into a service which is felt to be useful. At the other end of the spectrum, so we've got this two-tier problem where autism actually gets you a ticket to services that's not available to other people without the diagnosis. But at the other end of the spectrum, we have the situation where there is this assumption that if you have a diagnosis of autism, that certain presentations are part of the condition, and therefore there's nothing much we can do. So I don't know how many of you have had this experience, but certainly it happens in my service, where people who are referred, for example, with anxiety states, it might be assumed because they have a diagnosis of autism, oh, that's part of the autism, and therefore we can't do anything about that because that's just part of what their condition is. And there's somewhere an assumption that in order to work with anxiety of someone who's got a diagnosis of autism, you need some sort of super specialist expert who knows about autism, who knows about anxiety and autism. And actually, the more everyday therapists, practitioners don't have the skills to do this. So it becomes also a diagnosis that can exclude you from vital services that might actually be really important and helpful to you. So this is some of the things that I found in my clinical work about the reality of the, if you like, the natural life of the diagnosis. Where it has been useful is more for psychological reasons than actually evidence-based reasons. So people sometimes experience the diagnosis as validating, as somehow a recognition that things are not quite right, a sense that suffering has been recognized, and a fantasy that there is an explanation now. And with this fantasy comes the idea that there is, now that people understand what's wrong with me, there is now the promise that a particular treatment or a way forward will emerge. I say it's a fantasy, and I hope to demonstrate. Now, if we can keep that in mind, that is often a psychological pull towards the psychological functions of labeling, I think those psychological functions are actually much better served without recourse to use of labeling, because they're about people feeling listened to, about people feeling heard, about people being part of a collaborative process, and about you joining with people in the struggles to try and help improve matters where things have gone wrong. You follow me? Okay. Let me tell you a little bit about the scientific evidence. I'm just going to touch on a couple of key themes, because most of the evidence in terms of the idea that autism represents some naturally occurring condition relates to, firstly, genetics, and secondly, neuroimaging studies. The assumed high genetic propensity towards autism comes largely from twin studies. So what happens in twin studies is that you compare identical twins and the co-occurrence of a condition in identical twins, and of course identical twins share 100% of the genes, to non-identical twins. Non-identical twins share 50% of the genes. So the idea is, if the condition is much higher co-occurring in identical than non-identical twins, then this is evidence that there is a genetic component. However, when it comes to behavioral and emotional experiences, the whole twin model idea for thinking about the influence of genes is flawed. Because, for example, we know that identical twins share some unusual environmental and psychological characteristics. For example, they're more likely to play with switching identities and tricking people. They're more likely to have the same clothes. They're more likely to be treated in a similar manner, and so on and so forth. So we know that being part of an identical twin is a unique psychological experience in itself, which means that you cannot, when it comes to behavioral and emotional experiences, because remember, all that genes code for are proteins. They don't code for behaviors. They don't code for emotions. They code for our protein structure. All you can really, for the twin study basis is not adequate to disentangle which bits are environmental from which bits are to do with your biological inheritance. And really the only way to do this is to do molecular genetic studies. So when people, and now that we've decoded the whole genome sequence and it's become quicker and cheaper to do whole genome sequencing studies, we now have thousands of people with various diagnoses, including with the diagnosis of autism, who've been through these molecular genetic studies, and the cupboard is empty in terms of finding some characteristic patterns of inheritance at the molecular genetic level. So this is some of the types of conclusions that's coming up. So from 2012, this was from a review, a series of review articles that appeared in the magazine Nature. So Nature is one of the top scientific journals, so this was kind of a review of the state of the art. Here's a couple of quotes. Many research teams have searched for genes that may be involved. They haven't turned up any prime candidates yet. Only dozens, maybe hundreds of bit players. First genome-wide association studies, this is another quote, on autism implicated 2 regions with mild effects. Subsequent genome-wide association studies failed to turn up any parts of the genome with statistical significance. This is the state of play across most psychiatric diagnoses. The thing that's coming up again and again is that where there is evidence of genetic differences, abnormalities, they tend to be in people who have intellectual disability. So we've known for a long time that people with intellectual disabilities are at risk of all psychiatric disorders, not any specific ones. How that works is, of course, open to speculation, because people with intellectual disabilities are more likely to be bullied, they're more likely to suffer trauma, more likely to have peer relationship problems, etc., etc. But it would appear that intellectual disability, at least, there is sufficient evidence for us to say there is likely to be a significant genetic component. But once you control for that, very little further is coming up. So when we look at genes and autism, the cupboard is empty. There's nothing specific coming up. And the same when we look at neuroimaging in autism. What we see is a picture, and I've been looking at this for many years now, and it's been impressive the regularity with which one team or another comes up with and gets press coverage for they're onto it. They've begun to find what it is that's going on in the brains of children or young people or adults with an autistic spectrum disorder. And with time, other teams will try and they'll fail to find that. This is a couple of examples. So there was a team a while back that came up with some evidence that they said that they had noted that there was significant increases in cerebellar volume in a group of people that they had done some brain imaging scans with. However, subsequent teams got very excited about this, so they started looking at this. Some teams found smaller than average cerebellar volumes, other teams found no difference, and so we get this picture of a consistently inconsistent findings. That's the basic picture that we find in neuroimaging research. One of my favorite ones was the brain connectivity theory, which was a theory that there's an area of the brain with lots of white matter in the middle called the corpus callosum, which includes a lot of the area where connections between the different hemispheres are made. One team got interested in another team's finding that it had found that this area was smaller in the people that it looked at with an autistic spectrum disorder. And they were interested because they knew that it was actually technically quite challenging to scan the brains of young people with the types of scans that we're using, where you're asking people to keep their heads still for quite long periods of time. And they found that just by getting people to move their head a bit in the brain scan, they could replicate this idea of a diminished. So you've got huge technical challenges. When we do brain scanning, and this is a whole interesting area, the whole area of neuroimaging and our fascination and seduction, I would say, by the idea that we can reduce our various mental functions to specific areas of the brain. So there's what I call neurobollocks going on all over the place. You know, this is the center for consciousness. This is the center for falling in love, and it brings back. Have any of you heard of the phrenology movement? So this is a modern form of phrenology. What brain scans do is they have to. There are huge technical challenges for a start. So, for example, when you're looking at anatomical differences, you're using computer voxels. So these are little building bricks. In each tiny voxel that they have, where you're building pictures of this brain, you've got millions and millions of neurons. It's really hard to know how to conclude from these kind of pretty pictures of brains what it is that you're actually referring to. It's a bit, to me, like trying to figure out the plot to EastEnders by looking at the hardware behind a television set. You know, that's the kind of, that's the sort of jump in thinking that you would need to think that you can go from these, adding together these tiny voxels to see where there are differences in activity or differences in structure, coming up to conclusions about behavior and emotional experiences and so on and so forth. And again, in a review in that Nature magazine that I mentioned, until its biological basis is found, any attempts to use brain imaging to diagnose autism will be futile, and that's as it's proved to be. We're no closer to getting to any biological markers for this diagnosis. One of the issues that is interesting is that when I first started practicing in child psychiatry as a trainee back in the early 90s, we were still in the era where autism was viewed as a very rare condition. The early epidemiological studies put the prevalence of autism at 4 in 10,000, 0.4% of the population, in other words. So in my whole time of training, my whole 4 years of training as a child psychiatrist, I came across 2 young people who were diagnosed with autism. The picture is very different now. It's suddenly, there's been an explosion. And you have to question what is going on in a concept that can go from 0.04% of the population to what is now thought of as about 1.5% of the population in the space of just 2 or 3 decades. What is going on in a construct that is amenable to doing something like that? And one of the problems that comes in is this issue of heterogeneity. Our diagnostic criteria have become very wide and very flexible, and because they point towards common and qualitatively similar traits to that you will find in most children, well, that you will find in the case of autism in most men, as my wife keeps reminding me, you find that actually it crosses over, many of the symptoms cross over with those that are described in other conditions. So, for example, the idea of having a poor ability to read things socially. Apart from men, you've got language disorders, ADHD, anxiety, depression, personality disorders, attachment disorder, bipolar disorder, psychosis, learning difficulties, normal variation, boredom, etc., etc. There's lots of things out there that describe states where you have difficulty for all sorts of different reasons and backgrounds, reading social situations. Cultural difference, you know. An interesting one is cultural difference because there's meant to be a much higher rate of autism amongst children of immigrants than amongst children of host countries. So that brings me back to that question, from a scientific point of view, what is autism? Here's a couple of, I've mentioned the Nature magazine, and there was an edition of The Psychologist 2014, which was devoted to autism, and it had lots of articles about autism. And I think the article that summed it up was one written by a trainee who was looking into the whole issue. And she basically came to the conclusion, we still don't really know what autism is, despite decades of autism research. Most likely reason is that there is no such thing, from a scientific perspective, as autism. So, in my opinion, autism is a cultural fact, not a scientific one. It is something that we encounter regularly. So it has become part of our cultural language, part of our social constructs. I will move on from here. and start thinking about what does that mean from a clinical point of view. This is where I think we do what I call a game of semantics. So if I was to ask you what is autism, based on our current knowledge, the only way you can answer this question is to describe sets of behaviors. So difficulty, the traditional triad was difficulty in social reading, various language difficulties, and restricted and stereotyped imagination. DSM-5 has changed that a little bit, but there are various versions of that. Now, if I was to ask you what is diabetes, then as a medical practitioner, if I was to answer that question, if that question was asked to me by just describing sets of behaviors, so if I was to answer that by saying diabetes is feeling thirsty a lot, going to the toilet a lot, getting fatigue, a propensity to get infections, I would potentially be at risk of being struck off, because those types of presentations, those types of behaviors can occur with a number of different conditions. What I would need to do as a medical practitioner is to access what I call independent and validated data to support my conclusions or my hypothesis. So I would want to do a blood glucose, especially a fasting blood glucose. I'd want to test the urine for blood and ketones and various other tests that I might want to do to either confirm my diagnosis or to collect evidence that there might be other things going on. So that means that in the rest of medicine, the way a diagnosis functions is as a technically important hypothesis that points me towards specific physiological processes, and that would have a big implication on the treatments I then choose. If I started treating somebody with insulin who didn't have diabetes based on these presentations, I could potentially kill them. So it's actually very important for me to match my diagnosis to possible causal processes. Whereas with a diagnosis like autism, I cannot do that. All I can do is point towards specific behaviors. So it acts as a descriptor. It cannot act as an explanation. Do you follow me? So to put that in another way, if I was to be asked, this kid has trouble mixing with peers, what is causing that? And if I was to answer with, well, it's caused, in other words, as an explanation by autism, then a legitimate question would be, how do you know it's autism? Well, my answer would be, because they have trouble mixing with peers. So if we start using diagnoses like autism as an explanation, we get stuck in philosophical tautologies, we get stuck in a circular. And I think that's very important. It's very important to keep in mind that a diagnosis like autism, as it functions at the moment, can only function as a descriptor. I think I've showed why it's quite a bad descriptor. It cannot function as an explanation. When you have a diagnosis of autism, you have not discovered the cause. You have not discovered anything about the reasons for. Yeah? You might find it useful to have a descriptor, but do not confuse it with an explanation. Does it have any prognostic value? Does it predict anything? And this is where I think we get into some, for me, quite distressing territory. I've had young people in my consulting room who have been expressing suicidal thoughts because they have been saying, I hate this diagnosis, I wish I didn't have it, it's ruining my life. And they have been told that they have a potentially lifelong brain disorder. And actually, our definitions of autism are now so broad that only recently have people started looking at some of the outcomes for people who get this broader diagnosis of autism and looking at what their outcomes are when they move into adulthood. And there are a number of studies that seem to be showing that actually significant proportions, maybe up to around a third of people who get the current diagnosis of autism, grow out of it. They actually don't have any of the symptoms. And even those who do, many of them have the potential to function quite well. And furthermore, their potential to function quite well seems to be independent of whether they received any treatment or not. That does not seem to be... there's some very interesting articles around some of these outcomes. One of the things that I picked up, and this is just, if you like, more of a hypothesis, relates to the issue of, which I'm going to mention in a minute, of what I call internal stigma, an internalization of the idea that you have a lifelong disorder which you can do nothing about. People who are more likely to reject the idea that they can do nothing about what's going on and that they can take ownership of their life and make changes and be in control, whether they choose to continue with the idea that they have something called autism or neurological difference or whatever you want to call it or not, are more likely to have good outcomes than those who stick with a more passive idea about what they have. And because we have such wide definitions these days, you can apply the same diagnosis to people who are going to have great problems functioning independently and are going to require potentially lifelong forms of care, to people who've been suggested retrospectively to have presented with features of autistic spectrum disorder, like Mozart, like Van Gogh, like Einstein, and there's a whole list of them if you go and look on the internet. And that, to me, is virtually the entire human spectrum, isn't it? Now, you can't tell me that the needs of someone who is finding it difficult to have an independent life and requires ongoing care and has significant learning difficulties are the same as somebody who is, discovering theory of relativity. Surely, how useful is a label that has such a wide spectrum of outcomes and functioning? There is a little bit of data. One of the things that we haven't looked at properly is what is the impact of having a label on your outcomes? So we've got nice guidelines. We've got 3 nice guidelines in relation to autism, about its assessment, about setting up services, about treatments. None of them have looked at this question of what is the impact of labeling? What impact does that have on people's long-term outcomes, and particularly their functional outcomes? And I think that's such an important question to have before we rush headlong into this continued expansion of the diagnosis and people receiving the diagnosis. So there is some evidence from a national data set that's held by an organization called Consortium for Outcome Research in CAMHS, CORC, maybe some people have heard of that have been collecting outcome data. Now, the database is quite flawed because they've only been able to collect something like 20% of people who do the first rating scale, and then they're meant to do a second rating scale of outcomes based on the strength and difficulties questionnaire at 6 months or at the end of treatment. So it's based on, these findings are based on incomplete data. But from the data that they have gathered, if you can see this at the bottom. Is that showing? Oh well.
You have to point to there, over to there, to get it to change rather than to the screen.
No, I'm just looking at the. If you look at the bottom, that line in the middle is that when they looked at the second outcomes, this was the line compared to people who are not receiving services, so compared to studies of the natural history of people who present with a certain level of impairment at presentation for treatment from a CAMHS service. And those with a diagnosis with autism seem to be significantly worse after input and treatment, according to this data, from CAMHS services. We should be taking data seriously and look into that a bit further. Is there something actually about receiving a diagnosis that leads to potentially worse outcomes? We don't know that question. There's a little bit of evidence that suggests that at least this needs to be looked at a lot more thoroughly before we continue doing what we're doing. I've mentioned about stigma. I want to leave enough time for us to discuss this. We're now exporting the concept of autism globally, despite the fact that there are huge cultural variations around the world in how we understand things like social communication, particularly social communication between children and adults. These are very culturally constructed issues. So a particularly disturbing one, for example, is a study that was done in South Korea with 55,000 kids. And they came to the conclusion, using our Western construct of autism, that 2.6% of children attending mainstream school and who were nearly all of them not receiving services could be diagnosed with an autistic spectrum disorder. I find that quite disturbing. What now happens to those children who have been in that study, who it's now been suggested that they have this condition? And it is assumed that our concept of autism, which I would argue is highly culturally constructed, based on our ideas about social communication, imagination, and so on. What happens now to those children? What impact will just being part of that study have, let alone how it will ripple out wider into that culture? So there's lots of these questions that we are not asking. And as I said, with regards to treatment in autism, we have very little evidence that any of the treatments that are called autistic treatments, or treatments that were specifically designed for children with autism, would not also be helpful to children with a similar degree of difficulties, particularly in the area of learning difficulties. So the studies that have been done have failed to find a significant difference between children who have the diagnosis when you compare it to children of a similar level of learning difficulties who don't have the diagnosis of autism. And interestingly, most of the studies you hear about, whether it's TEACH or PECS or these types of programs that are marketed as autism-specific programs, have failed to do the randomized controlled trials comparing with children, the intervention with children of similar difficulties who don't have the diagnosis. And there is a disturbing example from risperidone, which is an antipsychotic, is now being used and has been for several years, and it kind of got the seal of approval from one of the leading child psychiatrists in the UK a few years back in an article in the British Medical Journal, where they said that even though risperidone isn't licensed for use in children with autism and who also have behavioral difficulties, they thought that there was good evidence that it should be used and that it is helpful. In that article, which was an editorial in the British Medical Journal, they quoted 2 studies. If you look at these 2 studies, there was, both of them were for about 6 months. In both studies, the children receiving the risperidone compared to the placebo gained an average of 2.7 kilograms in 6 months, compared to the over and above what happened in the control group. There was a decrease in problematic behavior. That decrease was much less by 6 months, so some of the behavioral problems were returning after 6 months. And about 50% of the group were receiving risperidone had shown a significant decrease in behavior problems. However, there was also a report of about 60% of children in those groups being described as having somnolence as an adverse effect. Now, somnolence is sleepiness. In other words, what was happening in the study was these, which are also classified as major tranquilizers, were acting as tranquilizers. They were sedatives. The decrease in behavior problem was due to the effects of sedation on the children. Is that the path we want to go down? So this is some of the issues that we end up. So they were recommending that risperidone could be used, and in fact should be used, to help for behavioral problems with children with autism. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So my final thing. When I presented at a conference a couple of years back, I was on straight after a consultant who was talking about a new national clinic that they set up for adults with an autistic spectrum disorder. What the clinic, and it seems to be quite typical of clinics that are being set up for adults at the moment, provided was an assessment. The assessment took most of the day. And at the end of the assessment, they said yes or no, kind of, you have an autistic spectrum disorder or you don't. They didn't provide any treatment. They gave them advice about books or about online programs and so on, but they provided no treatment. That's all the service provided. The consultant had said that they had just diagnosed their 100th person. And her comment, which I then repeated when I did my presentation, kind of encapsulated the problem for me. Her comment was that if I put all those 100 patients that we've diagnosed into the room together, you'd struggle to figure out what they had in common, because they're all so different. So what was the point of diagnosis? How the hell is that meant to help you understand what would be most useful to help these people through whatever problems they have? So I'll finish there. So did you want to say what to do now, or yeah? Because I think what we thought was to now repeat your earlier thoughts. So have 10 minutes to speak amongst yourself, rethinking again the conversations you had before the presentation, and see where it leads to now. And then if you do that for 10 minutes, we could have some questions and comments and things from the floor.
We have a question from somebody over here.
I was just wondering what you thought about the research about the part of the brain processing objects rather than processing people, whether you think that's also, like, doesn't really hold up. I don't know. I'd heard that was a good there's always, I mean, we've been looking at these types of theories for a while, and I suspect it'll go nowhere, just as all the other theories have. But
even if it does, I would get suspicious by the idea that there's something kind of almost quite autistic about this research, don't you think? It's kind of, limiting our imagination as to the multidimensionality of human experience, as if you can kind of carve these bits off one by one. So I wouldn't. You see, one of my problems about, I know we always have to construct some sense of idea or some sense of some theory about what's going on as part of our attempts to hopefully collaboratively work with people. And my worry about getting too hooked up with particular biological models, because there's some biological models that I found quite useful. So, for example, the idea of how we respond to stress biologically and how the sympathetic and parasympathetic system work together, because that can be a way into thinking about how to deal with levels of arousal, which might be very important for some people you work with. So I'm not against using biological hypotheses, but I think if you maintain an awareness that that's what you're doing, that if you don't maintain that awareness, you can end up promoting some very concrete ideas about what's happening with a person. And some of these can be quite disempowering, particularly if they lead to a sense, that limits your and other people's imagination about your possibilities, which is not quite the same as saying acceptance about who you are and how you function in the world. But it can be very disempowering, and I think that's what I've seen in clinical practice, when people start to think that I've got something going on that's peculiar in my brain that means that I can't do this or that, I can't do this or that, and it can kind of limit people's imagination.
Okay, have we got other questions?
Sami, your fourth point is really interesting, undiagnosed if desired, on that slide. And I just wondered from your perspective what that looks like in practice for educational psychologists who are predominantly not medical professionals or located within medical teams at all.
So in clinical practice, one of the things that I really advise is I don't get involved in arguments about whether a person has autism or doesn't have autism. If people come to me who've already been diagnosed and that's become part of the way, what I essentially recommend is you can deconstruct diagnosis, and you can do it very easily. And it's just to explain that a diagnosis like that simply describes something. That might be quite useful, but it won't provide an explanation. In order to figure out what might be most helpful, let's figure out what's important to you, what changes it is that you're working towards. So I kind of take the diagnosis and do something to make sure it's put to one side. Now, I have had situations where people have come a certain distance in their work with me, and they've come to the conclusion, because I've discussed that there is a potential stigmatizing if an employer, and you have to in the book that I wrote with a couple of people, the book was called The Myth of Autism, it's that one. The people I wrote it with, the two other people, both of whom had been diagnosed with an autistic spectrum disorder. One of them found that when he stopped declaring that he'd got this diagnosis, he started getting invited to job interviews. So I think that's also something to bear in mind, that, so I have discussed that with some people. I had someone, for example, who wanted to apply to go into the army, and that would have been, so we officially, it just means that I wrote a letter to the GP and said he no longer has autism. He no longer has the symptoms, you know. I guess you'd probably need to find a sympathetic doctor who would be happy to do that.
Any more
But
questions?
the basic point is, when you're working with people, put aside the label of autism. Just put it to one side.
Okay, I think there's somebody in the middle.
This is an observation rather than a question, but I think the discussions on our table really came to the conclusion that this was some quite cynical political phenomena, that it's actually about gatekeeping resources by putting lots of restrictions and stages in accessing support. You massively reduce the numbers who would have access to them, and therefore services can cope, because all of the evidence that you've shared today suggests that these sorts of interventions make a big difference for a whole range of people, but we choose somehow to specialise particular populations to access resource, whether it's people with autism or people with dyslexia. And I think the sense as educational psychologists is that we should feel free of those boundaries and restrictions and just make sure that those who most need the support, rather than those who have the most effective parents or systems around them that are most facilitating, and that it's actually a very empowering message that you've shared today.
Any other questions? We've got another 5 minutes. Any other?
Thanks, Sami. Our question was, is there an appetite, do you feel, in commissioning health authorities to develop a more formulation-driven approach? I know you do it in Lincolnshire, but is there an appetite for that, do you think?
We don't do it in Lincolnshire, unfortunately. And we do have what seems to be happening at the moment, and it's partly because of lack of finances, and it kind of relates to the point that you just made as well, is that what's being set up are services for diagnosis, particularly amongst adults. And some sort of low-level training in recognizing autism. So we have in my own trust an online training thing which is not very good. It takes about half an hour, and it's part of our mandatory training for everyone in my trust to do this thing about recognizing autism. And that's kind of about it. As I said with the comment about the person who was discussing their service following the first 100 people who'd been diagnosed, we just don't know what impact that is having. So people get a diagnosis and it's kind of, what now? And that's the sort of, seems to me a more important question, not whether you diagnose them with a particular condition, but what are the things that made them want to seek help? What are the things that they want to see different in their life? How is that going to help them achieve any of the changes that people who are wanting or wondering about, what is it that actually brought them to services? What is it that what benefit might they get in terms of their own aspirations and goals? And that kind of goes missing with these types of narrow approaches that are being taken.
Okay, we've probably got time for one more question, or... All right.
Hi, that's very interesting. You said, if I remember correctly, that autism does exist if there is an intellectual disability. I wonder whether you could say more about how you define intellectual disability and how you came to that conclusion.
I didn't say autism does exist. As in, what I was saying, I don't know which bit you were picking up on. What I was saying is that there is evidence about, so it's basically studies that have looked at genetics and looked at levels of IQ, and people with lower IQs, particularly when you go with the group that are often defined as mild learning and moderate learning difficulties, so IQs below 70 and so on, there is good evidence that there are higher levels of genetic differences and abnormalities, such as, for example, there are higher levels of so-called copy number variants, which is bits of genetic code that are missing, or bits of genetic code that are repeated in children with lower learning difficulties. So that's where the evidence is pointing that there is something biologically going on. But what I also mentioned is that the fact that this group have higher levels of psychiatric difficulties it's kind of more complicated to figure out why they might have higher levels of psychiatric. I think it's reasonable to assume they probably find it harder to negotiate their way around the world. But we also know, for example, children who are categorized as having intellectual disabilities are more likely to be bullied, more likely to struggle with peer relationships, more likely to experience traumatic events, have low self-esteem, etc., etc. So that was, yeah.
Question, because I'm aware that some people in this room would not accept you can measure intellectual disability. So that was what I was focusing on.
Yeah.
How you define.
Yes, I'm fully aware of all of those limitations, and I'm fully aware of the potential for labeling and the natural life of labels in young people and adults who have intellectual disabilities, and also the many studies about the problems in cross-cultural definitions, because we tend to assume certain skills and tend to give them greater credence in the way that we measure intellectual disability. So I'm fully aware of those, and I was just commenting on studies that have used IQ as their measure.